see sailboats anchored in the bay, and beyond them, ships of the U.S. Navy. Then they drove north, out of town, through the slums of the island, where thin, stick-like black children played barefoot in the dusty streets, wearing T-shirts with incongruous slogans like Minnesota, Land of 1,000 Lakes, and Grand Canyon National Park. And they passed shacks with iron corrugated roofs, colorful clothes hanging on backyard lines, chickens walking about, goats tied to trees, and old washing machines with cranks that pulled clothes through a pair of rollers that wrung them out, and pumps with tubs beside them where the people drew their water. And they passed dumps with empty oil drums, machine fittings, rolls of old wire, and concrete blocks. Then they were driving through open country, green mountains in the distance, past fields littered with billboards advertising cigarettes, soda, beer, and different airlines, and came into the residential area where they passed beautifully landscaped homes surrounded by iron fences and cement walls, topped with barbed and concertina wire, beyond which they could hear dogs barking. The next day they rented a motorboat, and the engine cut off in rough seas, in a squall, and waves were breaking over the hull, and she was trying to bail out the water, but wasn't getting anywhere, while he was yanking the cord that starts the engine, without success, and they were sinking and couldn't reach the life jackets which were in the forward hold, way underwater, and a ferry boat called the Bomba Charger, with tourists dancing the calypso, came by, and he and Michelle screamed for help at the top of their lungs, waving desperately, while these people who seemed to be having the time of their lives good-humoredly waved back, and the ferry passed off into the distance. He was sure they were going to die, and wondered sadly what Naeem would think if she found out he'd drowned with another woman in St. Thomas. But then he got the boat started again, and they made it out of the choppy water and into a quiet cove before the engine cut again. They were so relieved they just lay back on the boat, in the sun. Then he swam into shore, climbed a palm tree with his belt, the way he'd seen natives do it, and broke off some coconuts which fell to the ground. And he found a fruit called the knip, and some soursop, another fruit, and swam back and forth to the boat with the coconuts and the knips and the soursop in his teeth, laughing like a pirate, and climbed in, and they ate the fruit, and relaxed, and felt giddy, and after a few hours they swam into shore and walked back to the hotel. That night they took pillows and sheets and blankets from their rooms, drove to the top of the mountain in the middle of the island, and made love in the clouds. It was raining, and there was lightning and falling stars, and all you could see were the stars and the ocean. It was as if the island didn't even exist below them, because the clouds covered it, and they knew how special the moment was. They would never have another time like this in their lives. And yet, the irony of it all was that he wished he were with Naeem, and not Michelle, and felt cheated that the perfect moment had been created for him with the wrong person. Their last day there, while they were packing, he said to Michelle, "You know, I've always wondered what's behind those doors the employees disappear through. Can we go in one of them?" "Of course we can," she said. "My father owns the place." So they went down to the lobby and walked through a door that said, "Employees Only." And they entered a dank hallway with cinder block walls painted 2 shades of green, the flat concrete floor beneath them covered with wads of chewing gum, roach pellets, rat traps, rows of carts full of linen, and trays of half-eaten food. They passed the laundry room, where they saw a group of blacks standing ankle-deep in water, stoking large bundles of soiled towels, sheets, and blankets, and shovelfuls of industrial-strength detergent into huge washing machines that looked like blast furnaces on a battleship, women folding and stacking the clean laundry, and climbing ladders to place it on racks along the walls, the air so heavy with humidity that they could feel a hot, moist wave pass out over them like a cloud. They continued down the dimly lit hallway, and a door suddenly opened, offering a brief view of the hotel lobby, like a vision of heaven, where he could glimpse, for a moment, the atrium with its tropical plants and flowers, a group of well-dressed tourists talking and laughing, the pleasant sound of orchestral music wafting in, abruptly cut short as the door closed and a bellman in a bright red uniform, brass buttons, and spit-shine shoes walked hurriedly past them, his face twisted in a grimace. And they stopped to look in the employees' cafeteria, where maids, busboys, waiters, clerks, and doormen sat at tables eating and complaining about the stink of human sewage from the guest bathrooms that had backed up through the grates of the cafeteria floor. And they passed the kitchen, where there was a lot of screaming and cursing in different languages, and the sound of frying foods, and pots and pans clanking, cooks hovering over stoves, dripping wet, wearing towels around their necks and tucked into their shirts to absorb the perspiration, their aprons stained with animal blood, vegetable fat, drops of grease, tomato juice, and pastry filling. And he thought how the other part of the hotel was serviced by this part, and that to have so much beauty, perhaps you had to have this much degradation. It created a balance, a symmetry, the ease and grace and elegance of the guest areas balanced by this chaotic, filthy, cavernous, underground world of sweating, laboring people, mostly blacks, working in backed-up sewage from the guest toilets upstairs, which were scrubbed and polished and covered with sterilized paper. And Michelle was appalled and said she'd talk to her father. But he knew it wouldn't make any difference. Used to be a dog named Beauregard who was famous in the Caribbean because he hitchhiked. He was part basset hound, part something else, and he'd sit at the side of the road, and eventually someone would come along and pick him up. Then, after a while, he'd bark when he wanted to get out, and in this way he hitchhiked all over St. Thomas. Then, one day, when he was hanging around the harbor, he somehow managed to get on the ferry to St. John. He visited there for a few days and then caught a ferry back to St. Thomas. And after that, he became a regular commuter. A year or so later, he was down at the Antilles airboat dock when one of the pilots invited him on board for the flight to St. Croix. So he flew over to St. Croix, hitchhiked into Christiansted, and when he got bored with that, he went back to the dock and caught the next amphibious plane to St. Thomas, where he usually hung out at a bar called the Safari and a restaurant called the Left Bank, which was owned by a French couple. And periodically, he'd return to the Antilles airboat dock for another trip to St. Croix. And so, over the years, Beauregard became famous in the islands for his travels. Everyone knew him. A popular song was written about him. Actually, for a while early in his career, he had a partner, but the other dog finally dropped out because he couldn't handle the pressure. He didn't mind the hitchhiking and the ferry rides, but he didn't want to go on planes, so he withdrew and returned to the dog world. And Beauregard was looked after and fed by everyone. He was treated like royalty. Many people believed he was really someone who died and come back as a dog. Well, he grew old and venerable, and finally he died. And there was a funeral procession through Charlotte-Amalie, the capital of St. Thomas, the street crowded with mourners, Beauregard's body carried in a small pine coffin. And it was on the day and time of Beauregard's funeral that he and Michelle took a cab to the airport, got caught in the incredible traffic jam the funeral created, and missed their plane.
everybody gets a higher feeling. But way deep down inside, spiritual healing. So good, good, good. Good for your bad feeling. Spiritual healing. So good.
When he got back to Washington, he gathered the newspapers that he'd collected on his doormat and carried them into his apartment. Later, when he scanned the headlines to catch up on the news he'd missed, he came across the headline, "Israel Embassy Bombed." Below was a photo of a man in a business suit lying in a pool of blood on a driveway, a twisted pair of sunglasses scattered near his head. The man's face was familiar to him. He felt a wave of nausea. The man, described as an unidentified Arab terrorist, had somehow managed to get into the embassy compound, across the grounds without being observed, had apparently climbed in the building through a basement window, planted the bomb, and had almost escaped before being seen by an off-duty plainclothes guard. One theory being studied was that he'd been furnished with detailed plans of the embassy's highly sophisticated network of surveillance and alarm systems, which he'd somehow managed to compromise. It represented a serious breach of security, which was being investigated by Mossad. He sits in his room, looking out the window, wondering, who am I? How will I finally be defined? Waiting for a knock on the door. Then things began to collapse at his job at the studio. He wasn't bringing in enough work for them to justify his salary, and they let him go. He had to suffer the indignity of going on unemployment. Michelle observed his decline and told him about a group called LifeSpring and how a number of years ago she'd gone to a weekend retreat and it had done wonders for her. "You're in a state of crisis," she said, "and I think it could help you a great deal." She said she'd also encouraged a number of friends to take it, and they'd benefited tremendously. But he resisted. "No, that's not for me." "You won't know unless you try," she said. Then, in April, Naeem called him. 4 months had passed since they'd last spoken. She said, "I haven't heard from you in a long time. I wanted to know how you are." He was speechless. Hadn't she told him she never wanted to speak to him again? Then she said she might be coming to Washington in May, and she'd call later in the month to give him details. And his heart melted in the space of a minute, and he said, "It's still upsetting hearing your voice because I still love you." She laughed and said, "Well, why is that such a bad thing?" And he couldn't understand what was going on. The telephone call marked a turning point with Michelle, who was beginning to want the relationship to become more serious. In the middle of May, he got another call from Naeem. She said she'd be arriving in a week. Could she stay in his place? He said, "Sure." Then he was waiting at Dulles Airport again, with an incredible sense of déjà vu, feeling the same quality of nervousness in a crowd of Arabs. Only this time, he didn't know why she was coming here. And when she came through the door, his heart expanded, and he knew he still loved her. He kissed her on the cheek. He felt choked and could barely speak. When they arrived at his apartment, he said, "The minute I saw you, I knew I was still in love with you." And he burst into tears. She began to cry too, and they made love on the floor. As the days passed, he didn't know what to make of her visit. When he brought up her relationship with David, she said, "Oh, he's just a kid. He helps me with the garden." But she did acknowledge they'd been lovers. They saw her old friends. They were invited to dinner a few times and attended a party. Then they went to see Star Trek II. He figured the film couldn't present any trouble, but before it came on, they showed the coming attractions for a comedy called The Best Defense with Dudley Moore and Eddie Murphy. The story was about the development of a new high-tech tank that was being tested in the Sinai and how the tank wasn't working out. It was a satire of the U.S. military, but the Arabs in it were depicted as fools. In one scene, a Palestinian woman with her children was screaming, "No, no, no," as the tank plowed down her house. And then Eddie Murphy stuck his head out of the hatch and said, "Sorry about that." And there was a scene of the turret of the tank out of control, machine-gunning clownish-looking Arabs ducking behind garbage cans and diving for cover behind walls and hiding behind trees. There were also the obligatory OPEC Saudi stereotypes in white robes and sunglasses. It turned out one of the reasons Naeem had come to the States was to divorce Kamal, who was based in Nashville and whose master plan was to compete with the wimpy hamburger stands in the Middle East. He had wealthy backers and was going to call his fast food hamburger chain Sheba. Naeem was furious because she felt he was debasing the name of the Queen of Sheba, one of the early biblical rulers of Yemen, when the country had been a matriarchy. When she came back from Nashville, he felt sadder and sadder. He said, "I don't want you to leave." She said, "I have to," and added, "Even if you hadn't been Jewish, I would have found a reason to leave you." He didn't understand her. Maybe she was acknowledging that the relationship had been hopeless on other grounds, and he felt his life was unraveling. He repeated that he didn't want her to go, but he couldn't ask her to marry him because he felt it would have been an insult to her and would have destroyed any feeling she had left for him. It must have taken so much strength for her to come to this point of resignation. So she packed again, and he was numb and speechless, and soon he sat in the airport lounge holding in his tears. She gripped his knee and said, "If you're going to cry, I want you to go." When it was time for her to board, they embraced, and she said, "Take care of yourself," and walked away. And again, she was out of his life. Michelle saw his situation as desperate. What was holding him back was his attitude, which was negative and self-destructive, an attitude that had poisoned every aspect of his life. And he was so unstable, he was finding her reasoning seductive. She asked him to please come to a guest event at LifeSpring, so he said he'd go. It was held at a Marriott hotel, in a ballroom with about 400 people. There was a man on a platform who spoke about LifeSpring for about an hour. Then they showed a film, and testimonials were offered by people in the room. The idea was that if you were at a point in your life where you felt you were being held back by some flaw in your personality, LifeSpring could help you move forward. The weekend sessions cost $450. He said, "I don't have money for this." She said there was a money-back guarantee, and if he didn't like it, he could have all his money returned. And he said, "I just don't believe it." At the event, they broke into many groups, which were structured so that you were the only guest in a group of 8 members. And they asked him if he had any questions for them. And then a black man said, "I wanted a job, and the minute I took LifeSpring, all these job offers came." Michelle was there too, and he didn't want to annoy her, so he tried not to act too cynical. But afterwards, in the car going home, when she asked him what he thought, he said, "I want nothing to do with this group." So then she didn't want to sleep with him anymore. She wanted to be his friend. If he took LifeSpring, they could see if things would improve. His employment was going to run out in a few months, and he was feeling desperate. Then, in a tense conversation with his parents, he learned they were in financial trouble. His father had put a great deal of their money in an investment firm headed by a good friend of his, but over a period of a year this friend had had a nervous breakdown. He'd begun to go crazy. The business had begun to fall apart. And a week before he'd filed for bankruptcy, he'd called to tell his father to take his money out. And his father had done it, but that was illegal. And there were a lot of people who'd lost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and these creditors were bringing suits against his father, who'd taken his money out through inside information. And they were trying to recover damages, because that money would have been spread out among the creditors evenly. And things didn't look very good from a legal standpoint, and his father was spending thousands on attorney's fees, and his parents' entire net worth was threatened, including their house and property, and his mother was in a rage. And Michelle called and told him that he must take the LifeSpring course to save himself, and he refused, and they had a tremendously violent argument on the phone, in which he said she was sick, she was crazy, a total sucker, that she'd been brainwashed, was stupid if she couldn't see through the scam, and he didn't want to be around someone who was a flake. And she screamed, "I knew you thought that all along. Why didn't you say so?" "Because," he said, "I tried to respect your feelings about it. But since you won't leave me alone on this is what I really think. These people are complete phonies. I've done some research and found that the guy who runs LifeSpring has been indicted in federal court. I never wanted to show it to you because I thought, well, what the hell, people can get good things out of bad things, but I don't want anything to do with it. And then he said, Michelle, don't ever bring up LifeSpring again, because if you do, I will not speak to you. There was a pause, and she said, I'll talk to you later, and hung up. And he sat down and wrote Naeem a letter. The gist of it was that it made no sense, according to the plot lines of their relationship, that anything should change. At best, they should have a friendship and pleasant memories. I'm just expressing my emotions, he wrote. I don't care if they sound rational or not, but this is how I feel. Let's do everything we can to get back together. I'm miserable without you. And when he'd finished the letter, he wondered, should I mail this or shouldn't I? And he added another note. How do you feel? If you're utterly insulted by this letter, just tell me. Whatever you do, don't not answer the letter. If the letter upsets you and you don't want me to write something like this again, just let me know how you feel. But please write. And he hasn't heard from her. He doesn't even know, what with the inconsistency of the Yemeni Postal Service, if she's gotten the letter. At some point, he'll have to call her. When you walk in the door, the first thing you notice are huge pictures of hamburgers and French fries, illuminated and glowing, 3D fantastic giant pictures of burgers on buns, and they're like murals, like Guernica, lit up from behind, vibrating. 2 great big white sesame buns, and at each end and going towards the center are giant curled green and white lettuce shavings, then thin slices of bright red discs of tomato sections, and melted cheese. And it's clear the cheese was once flat, but now it's enveloping the meat, hugging and embracing it, and you can see the rim of meat. It's very brown, it looks very thick, and the whole thing is imbued with a glistening liquid shininess. It looks warm and moist. But it's like clone food, since each hamburger is made in the image of an original archetypal model, since they're all identical. And the atmosphere is that of a public place that is being continuously manned by park attendants, and the waste is enormous. A hamburger is made, 30 seconds later it's been wrapped in paper which is put in a box. 15 seconds later that box has been put in a bag with a napkin, and 10 minutes after that, the bag, the box, and the paper are all in the garbage. Now reflect on that. If they removed the burger from the process, then you would be paying people to clean up and throw away paper. It's almost a sort of death wish for the planet. Everyone seems driven to consume the flesh of dead animals and trees. And the uniforms of the people who work there is a cross between gas station attendant and cheerleader squad, and they all behave in a stylized, good-natured way. There's a sort of standardized friendliness. And have you ever listened to the music they pipe in? The taped Arab songs? Of course, I'm talking about the new Sheba that just opened in Sana'a, one of an array of restaurants in this fast food chain, sprouting up all over the Middle East.